In the early days, Walt Disney was not famous. He was just the boss, and everyone liked him. His small company was struggling, and he worked hard along with his employees. One of the hardest working was Norm Ferguson, Disney's chief animator. Norm and Ray Fox worked together on many projects. In 1937, they were working on a new multi-plane camera. It was to be used for Walt's new project, Snow White. The men would work together until late in the evening. If Ray was not at home at dinner time, his wife Mildred would call Mary. Mary would fix a plate of supper for Ray, and Grace would take it to the studio. It was just a few minutes away from the Fox's house. Sometimes Mary would fix a plate for Mr. Ferguson. Grace made the dinner deliveries and soon became friends with Norm Ferguson. He looked forward to the visits from Ray's little sister. During one of her visits, the men were discussing Walt's new project. They had finished the animation sequences for Snow White. It was about a year away from being released. Mr. Disney was concerned that it would be a flop. The studio could afford to produce one more film, but it would have to be a success. Mr. Disney could not decide what story to use for his next film. He was looking to Norm for direction. The entire Disney staff was desperately searching for a new story. Several titles were suggested. The writers had begun a new story about a baby deer named Bambi. Someone suggested an adoption of Hans Christian Andersen's novel about a young mermaid. Nothing appealed to Mr. Disney. Grace sensed Norm's frustration and wanted to help. She suggested her favorite puppet story, Pinocchio. It was an Italian children's series that had been translated into English. Grace had a copy of the book. She received it as a Christmas gift from her Aunt Kate in 1907 when she was 9. She told Ray and Norm that she did not really like the story. It was too dark and sad. She had her own story that was much better. She created it as one of her puppet shows. Pinocchio was her favorite. Norm could vaguely recall the story, but was not familiar with it. He was curious, so he borrowed Grace's book. After reading it, he thought it would make a good story, but it would need many revisions. Late one evening, Mr. Disney was in the camera room with Ray and Norm. Ray was describing the many sets he had built for his sister's Pinocchio theater. Norm told Mr. Disney they thought it would make a good movie. Walt was curious. He had never heard of Pinocchio. Norm loaned him the book that he borrowed from Grace. Walt read only part of it. But Norm and his staff were excited about it, so we approved production in December of 1937. The announcement was made December 15th. In March of 1938, Mr. Disney halted production. It was not suited for Disney audiences. Everyone knew the boss wasn't happy with the way Pinocchio was developing, especially Norm. The story needed a new direction. Norm wanted to hear the story Grace created for her puppet show, and he wanted the boss to hear it too. Ray invited his little sister Grace to dinner with Ray, Norm, and Mr. Disney. They had dinner together many times before, but this time was different. They weren't in the carpenter shop, they were in Walt's new apartment upstairs. And Grace did not bring supper that night. Walt had it catered. This was important. They all wanted to hear Grace's story about Pinocchio. Grace felt perfectly at ease and was very comfortable. Norm and Mr. Disney were big kids, and she had been with the big kids all of her life. She was proud of her little story, and she knew it well. Grace was having fun. She started by saying in the book, Pinocchio was mean and a very bad boy, but her Pinocchio was nice, but sometimes did silly things that got him in trouble. And he didn't kill the cricket like the book said. They were friends. His name was Jiminy, and he helped Pinocchio stay out of mischief. What kind of mischief? Mr. Disney asked. Once, her father caught him at the pool hall, smoking cigars with his friends. The Blue Fairy made him clean his Uncle William's horse barn 60 miles away. While traveling there, he got lost. She went on to describe the many other adventures of her Pinocchio. Mr. Disney loved her stories, but what Grace was describing would be extremely difficult to animate. Norm agreed. It was difficult, but not impossible. They would need a multitude of new sets, all custom made and extremely detailed. They would also need to develop a huge crane that would work with their new camera. They looked to Ray. Ray had built Pinocchio sets for Grace since Christmas Day of 1908, when Grace was 10. It was the first project with his first set of tools. Ray assured Mr. Disney that his department could do a job that the entire studio could be proud of. The following day, on March 15, 1938, Walt called a staff meeting. According to one of his biographies, he was exploding with ideas. The rest of the story is well documented in books and films. The story writers and animators were soon bought in, and storyboards began to emerge. Production had begun on Disney's newest movie.